Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the writings of the Apostle Paul. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in today's lesson, we will focus on Philippians. Let's begin by sharing the screen and going to the PowerPoint slides. We've been looking at the prison epistles in our most recent lessons: Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians, 4 letters that Paul wrote while he was a prisoner in Rome between the years of 60 AD and 62 AD. If you'd like to know more about how Paul ended up in Rome as a prisoner, I would direct you to the lesson on Ephesians, where we included some details of how he made it from Jerusalem to Rome. But today we want to focus on Philippians, a letter written in 62 AD. The city of Philippi was located in Macedonia. It was a Roman province. It was about 10 miles inland from the port city of Neapolis, and it had a major highway, the Egnatian Highway, running through it. And so Philippi had the qualities that Paul really liked. It was a city with a large population. It was close to or right on the water, and it had a major highway moving through it. So there were going to be lots of people, not only who lived in Philippi, but people who were coming and going as a part of their business or pleasure. Let's pause for just a second and let's share a different screen and get our geographic bearings. So here's Rome, where Paul is a prisoner, and over here is Philippi in the province of Macedonia. You'll also notice Thessalonica is here. Berea, I'll mention Athens. I'll even mention Corinth as a part of this lesson. So all other than Rome, which is here, all of these cities that are going to be mentioned are kind of along the Aegean Sea. Let's switch back to the PowerPoint. One of the interesting things about Philippi is that even though it was a city in Macedonia, it had a very, very strong Roman presence. In fact, the dominant language in Philippi wasn't Greek. Archaeologists have found that the dominant language was Latin, which is what Romans spoke. One of the reasons for this was that Philippi had developed a reputation as a great place for Roman soldiers to retire after they'd finished their service. For whatever reason, there was something about Philippi that was attractive to them. And so there was a very large population of former Roman soldiers who lived in Philippi, and thus Latin was spoken quite frequently. Philippi was also polytheistic, meaning it had multiple gods that were worshipped within it. Paul spent extended time in Philippi during his second missionary journey. You can see this in Acts chapter 16, verses 11 through 40. Paul had also passed through Philippi at the end of his third missionary journey on the way back to Jerusalem. He had been in Corinth. He was ready to take the money to the Christians in Jerusalem. A plot against him was detected in Corinth, and so he and his companions walked north to Philippi, got on a ship in Philippi, and then sailed to Jerusalem. While he was in Philippi on his second missionary journey, Paul had converted Lydia and her household. That's Acts chapter 16, verses 11 through 15. In Acts 16, verses 16 through 19, we're told about a slave girl who was possessed by a demon and who could tell fortunes. And Paul drove the demon out of that girl, which greatly upset her owners because they made some very good money off of her very, very unique ability. Well, this angered her owners. And so they dragged Paul and Silas before the magistrates. The magistrates ordered that Paul and Silas were to be beaten with rods and then thrown into prison. Now, when we say prison, probably more along the lines of what we might call a county jail. During the night, an earthquake opened the doors of the jail or the prison, and all of the prisoners' chains were unfastened. And so the jailer, who was in charge of keeping everyone there, was afraid that everyone was going to escape. And so he was ready to kill himself. And Paul assured him that he didn't need to do that. Everyone was there. No one was going to run away. Because of that, the jailer took Paul and Silas, cleaned their wounds, fed them, took them to his home, and Paul preached to both the jailer and his family, and they all became Christians. The next day, the magistrates ordered that Paul and Silas were to be released. They had served their time, they could go on their way. But in an interesting little twist to the story, Paul said, well, we're not going to just walk away quietly. I'm a Roman citizen, and you beat me with rods, and you put me in prison or in jail, and you didn't even explain why that happened to me. And so the magistrates became very, very uncomfortable with that when they heard that Paul was a Roman citizen, because his rights had been violated. And so they issued an apology, and Paul decided that that was adequate. And so then they moved on. Now, what's interesting is that once Paul and Silas left Philippi, they went to Thessalonica. The very first lesson in our series was on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and you might recall that Paul had been driven out of Thessalonica under the cover of darkness because there was opposition to him. There were people in Thessalonica who wanted to kill him. He then went to Berea. The same thing happened there. And finally, the Christians in Berea put Paul on a ship and had him sail to Athens just to get out of the area. And so we have Thessalonica, Berea, then on to Athens. If all that sounds familiar, it's because that was covered in the first lesson in our series. Well, Paul's time in Philippi actually happened before he was in Thessalonica. So let's talk about the letter itself. Philippians was written during Paul's imprisonment in Rome. What's interesting is the church in Philippi was not in a crisis, and there was really not a doctrinal issue that Paul needed to address, unlike, say, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, where they were confused about the second coming of Christ, or 1st and 2nd Corinthians with all of the issues that the church in Corinth was having. That wasn't the case with Philippians. So the question becomes, well, then why was a letter needed? And the answer to that focuses primarily on three things. First of all, the church in Philippi, the Christians there, had learned that Paul was a prisoner in Rome. And so they put together what we might call a care package and sent it to Paul. And the person who delivered the care package was one of the members of the church in Philippi. His name was Epaphroditus. That's in chapter 4, verse 18 of Philippians. But while he was in Rome, Epaphroditus became very ill. In fact, he became so ill that he was at the point of death. And word of this had made it back to Philippi. And the believers there were very, very concerned about Epaphroditus. So Paul wrote this letter, and he had Epaphroditus deliver the letter to the church in Philippi to let them know that, yes, Epaphroditus, had been very ill, but he's better now. In fact, he's better to the point that he can travel and he can actually bring this letter to you himself. And Paul also thanked the church in Philippi for the gifts that they had sent to him. He said he's learned, to make do with whatever's available, but their gift was greatly appreciated. In chapter 2, Paul talks about the attitude of Christ, what some have referred to as the Christological hymn, that Jesus, though he was God, he was not selfish, he was not vain, but he was humble. He looked out for the interest of others. And Paul is reminding us that if we're going to be followers of Christ, if we're going to imitate Jesus and how he lived and what he stood for, that these are qualities that we should have. We should be humble. We should look out not just for ourselves, but for the interest of others. And we should not be selfish. We should not be vain. And finally, in chapter 4, Paul provides encouragement for the believers in Philippi, some verses that may be very familiar to us. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I'll say rejoice. That's chapter 4, verse 4. Be anxious for nothing. Verse 6 of chapter 4. Whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's right, whatever's pure, think on these things. Verse 8 of chapter 4. And verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. These are all verses that we see on calendars and bulletin boards and wallpaper on our phones and letterman's jackets. And it's good that Bible verses are displayed like that. But it's interesting to consider that as Paul wrote these things, he was a prisoner in Rome, and he had been a prisoner in Rome for nearly 2 years. Well, that's our introduction to the letter to the Philippians. Let's hope you take some time this week to read through it. 4 chapters, should be a fairly easy letter to read through. Should be able to do it in a single setting. Hopefully you'll have a new perspective on this letter. Next week, or in our next lesson, we will focus on what are known as the pastoral epistles, and we'll begin with 1 Timothy. I hope you can join us.